Actually, company first. I was going to say a few words.
Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Emma, I'm from Goat Track Theatre. Just a quick reminder that mentor sessions with 7 mentors are available by booking at reception. Our next panel is Festivals Transforming Everyday Spaces. Facilitator Bronwyn Davies, Coordinator of Cultural Services, Scenic Rim and Regional Council, with panellists Paul Osage from Anywhere Theatre Festival, Ruth Atkinson from Curious Arts Festivals and Aletha Beatson from Indigi Youth Arts. Please make them welcome.
Good afternoon again, everybody. As I say, Aletha Beatson is a First Nation producer involved with the Horizon Festival, Brisbane Street Art Festival and currently Yonder Festival. And my other guest to my left is Ruth Atkinson from Curious Arts Festival. This year, that's interesting. The audience's path from one precinct to another will be coloured by street performers, window display, pop-up stages and installation delivering discovering experiences in unusual spaces. And Paul Osage from Anywhere Theatre Festival, who's going to be talking about what makes a festival. So, I'm going to start with asking a question of all of you, is what makes a festival? Like, what is it? What are the ingredients of making a festival? Paul?
A festival? Look, I think a festival is one of those words that can mean anything, but I think one of the things that it does mean is it's about either celebrating or enjoying a space, acknowledging a space or acknowledging a community. And I think it's really about providing an opportunity for a community to get together in whatever form that is.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of parts to a festival. One is the vibe and the feeling and the excitement that you're going to something that's different. I think there's a place, obviously, that looks like there's something exciting happening. And it's about the community coming together with a focus on a particular thing that the festival's about.
I think, first and foremost, festivals have been happening on these lands for many, many thousands of years, since the very first sunrise, and there's a lot of the conversations that we now have in the sector around festivals that lose sight of that, and it really is a gathering, and it's potentially like a gathering of different groups of people coming together. I think if I can go back to a bit more of a decolonial version of what that is.
Technical issues. So if we were going, seems like there's a festival every day of the week, of all kinds, of all sorts, as this is evidence of it as well. What do you reckon are the ingredients that people recognise when they're looking at something that's called a festival? And then also, what are the ingredients as festival organisers that you put in place to make that festival?
I think a festival from the outset has to be something that there is a need and a desire. It's not something that can be, imposed. I mean, I think there's been some recent stories of attempted festivals where they just thought, this would be a great idea, let's do this. But there's been no buy-in, no real reason for it. And I think ultimately any successful festival has to have that connection, whether it actually comes out of what is already there or comes out of a response possibly to what has been before. And as a result, it means that festivals also may have a limited time span. Just because a festival happens one year, it doesn't mean that it's going to be relevant forever.
I'll refer, Curious Arts Festival is a very new festival, so why a festival? It's based in Toowoomba, for those that don't know, and it's only had one iteration early this year. So why a festival? It was kind of a Kirsten Bartholomew, who some may know from Expressions Dance Company, moved to Toowoomba. I moved from the Judas Wright Centre back to Toowoomba, and we looked at what was there in Toowoomba, what was missing in Toowoomba. I've not run a festival before. I've been involved in a couple, so we thought we should make a festival that invites a diversity of people in. And it grew from a place where we were talking to people about what Toowoomba is and the changes that we were seeing in Toowoomba, in the diversity of people, different communities, multicultural people across, I think there's 110 or so different multicultural nations and communities and people who are represented in Toowoomba now, and that wasn't being reflected in the offerings around town. So we decided to make a Curious Festival, which would eventually, and not in the first iteration, but eventually invite community to come together in, and as you were saying, all different types of people, different communities come together and celebrate.
So before we go on to Alethea, both of you have said it's about connection and being able to fill the gap, and you talk about diversity. So when you come up, when you recognise that there's a gap or there's some pathway that you think needs to be filled, what are the ingredients that you go, okay, this is what I'm going to need to include in this festival to bridge that gap?
That's about inviting the community to be part of it, I think, is seeing who is out there. So we looked, one of the principles behind the festival is about the artists who are living regionally in our area, so people who are practicing, professional artists, emerging artists, and having platforms and opportunities for them to be part of a festival, but also inviting other people in so that they can interact with, nationally or internationally renowned people.
So you have the vision, then you test that by looking at what's missing, and then you go and ask for feedback. So it's that consultation loop.
Yes.
And that's your primary ingredient?
I think.
Would you say that's your primary ingredient to it?
Yeah, so I mean, talk about the consultation or where the idea came from. For Anywhere Festival, it came out of there being a real gap, and for where it started in Brisbane, it was all about this idea that there were a whole range of performance types that were fighting over a small number of theatre slots to perform in. There was no real way for people to be able to to perform as much as they want. There'd be a 1 week slot once a year, and it was really from talking to the performers, and I'd say it's very much a performer-led festival. We saw fringe festivals where we felt that the performers were being, and still are in the whole part, exploited, and we wanted to create something where, as well as the rest of the community benefiting, that it wasn't just at the expense of performers. So from being involved with the scene and knowing a lot of people and seeing where they were going, I went, well, what's a way we can solve this problem? I didn't actually set out to make a festival of performance anywhere but theatres, but that was the answer to the problem that was there. And it also was a nice little hook. And that's where it's evolved, and then it's gained its own pace from that.
So, Alethea, I really love your sense of that notion of gathering. Which is sort of feels a bit more like a organic process. What would you say are the ingredients in that organic process, in that organic gathering that need? Is it about the call? Is it about how would you describe the ingredients for a festival from it?
And yeah, I think it's going to be trickier for me to answer that kind of question because I'm a First Nations producer in a festival, which means I'm telling the festivals what they're doing wrong. So I can tell them what ingredients they don't have. That's the traditional owners usually, but. So that's where that kind of becomes a little bit tricky. So, I talk about this at Splendour in the Grass recently in a forum. Like the biggest sponsor of that festival was the mob whose land it was on. I believe the biggest stakeholder in every festival in this country is the Indigenous group of people who's the traditional custodians of that land. And then also looking at, when we're looking particularly in urban centres or perhaps communities where people were sent to a long time ago, the people who now live there. And so for me, I'm I don't do a lot of cooking, so I don't know how to make the analogy for you, but like, that's the most important part. And I really hope that, and because that hasn't been the most important part in a Western sense of festival for a while now, my job and people like me are working with festivals to try and ensure that that connection comes back. Which, as we're moving more and more into, I'm thinking particularly with my music festival hat on, we're moving more and more into sustainability practice. Well, if we're caring for country and that's at the very foundation of what we're doing, then all other decisions are going to do that. If we're caring for, if we're looking at ways to engage, you know, if we're looking for volunteers and for staff and for artists and for everyone to engage in a way that's incredibly respectful of one another, well, if we're doing that from an Indigenous point of reference from the very foundation, then that's potentially going to be what filters through everything else. So yeah, there's ingredients that are missing and they're so essential.
Oh, it's really an interesting insight. So I might actually dive in with you a bit further. So can you tell us about, because the name of this session is about festivals in everyday places. So tell us about how your festivals have been located in those everyday spaces, which I guess is about engaging in a completely different way, breaking down some of these barriers.
Yeah, so I've worked with, so Horizon Festival happens on the Sunshine Coast, which is predominantly the Cubby Cubby people, which is where my ancestral lineage comes from, and Jinnabara people. It's very interesting being a First Nations producer on your, I guess, ancestral lands. I think the festival thought they lucked out, but then what really happened was me being like, I can't make that decision. Sorry, we have to go talk to many more people because I definitely cannot make that decision given the connection that I have to this place. Big Sound happens in the Fortitude Valley in Brisbane, and then Yonder Festival's happening in the Imbil, which is also in Cubby Cubby country, and then the Brisbane Street Art Festival happens, I guess, across Brisbane, and it's very, I think that one's a really obvious example because it's people making murals and in an art form that was quite hidden. From an Indigenous perspective, for me, working in that space is trying to remind people that we've been painting on surfaces here for a really long time, and as any establishment, as the Eurocentric version of street art is, I think some of the earliest graffiti is found in this country. So not only does the work that, like, the festivals themselves are transforming spaces and everyday places, but my job is to make sure that we're also transforming everyday people. And if we look at the general population of this country, particularly also outside of the arts, there are a lot of notions around what Indigenous art and culture is that are misconceptions or a homogenised view of something that is not homogenous, that is multi-layered and full of, like, as many constellations in the stars. And so making sure that the programming has that element to it as well. So it's very multi-layered, and it requires what I think Uncle Bruce Pascoe talked about as, you know, when you're an Indigenous person, just generally in this country, it requires a lot of mental gymnastics. So you can jump into like one space and then jump into another complicated space and try and navigate that the best you can.
Okay, that's very interesting. I love that analogy of the mental gymnastics. I know a lot of the people that we work with here on Mununjali country, I see them working on those mental gymnastics and how brilliant that is. And I think as a white fella, I certainly could learn from that. Very good. Ruth, from taking festivals to everyday spaces, can you tell us about what Curious Arts has done in that manner?
Well, in its first iteration, it was based in the smaller spaces of the Empire Theatre in Toowoomba, so not the 1,500-seater, but in the smaller spaces studio. There's a 1879 built church there that's a space now. There's a new black box space, and then there's a garden area in front of the church. So that was the core of that, but the grand plan, the 3 to 5 year plan, is to extend through different spaces and streets. So there's outdoor eateries, there's pubs and clubs close by, through to the City Hall and another part of the Toowoomba precinct. So expanding through that with pop-up street artwork, maybe getting involved. My friend Ben is in the front there, so we are collaborating with his festival, which is the Lit Festival, so a bit of projection, and we'll embrace each other's festivals separately and together around about the same month, or in the same month. Yeah, so the grand plan, I guess, is to activate more spaces than just the Empire. But in taking the first one there, we wanted to reinvent that. We didn't want it to be somewhere or something that people have seen before in that space. We wanted to change it. And the church became a garden of curiosity to explore, and you know, the garden became a place where you could meet street performers and have pop-up experiences and installation work, and yeah, so reinventing it to something that hasn't been seen before.
So I think that follows on from what Alethea was saying. You're putting art in spaces and in different ways so that people are seeing things with different eyes and they're understanding it in different ways, whereas if you go into a theatre, you know, the arts aficionados are going to the theatre, whereas if you're doing it in the mall or on the laneways, whatever, you're seeing it with different eyes. Is that what you found, and is that challenging?
And I also think it breaks down, you know, there's a tradition when you go into the theatre and you sit down and you know, there's certain things that you have to do. I've just been on tour out west with our Charlotte's Web show, and the children there haven't seen the show much before, so they didn't really know how to react. But I think that's also the case when you change a space. People come in, they experience it as they want to, as opposed to what they think they should be experiencing it as. So there's, and also the name Curious Arts Festival gives them a permission to explore in a different way.
I think sometimes having what I find festivals in spaces that are accessible is for people, sometimes there's a certain, and I know this because my family are this, so my family are very much, despite there being quite a number of us who are in the arts, we're very much sport. I'm a Beatson, so anyone from Queensland might understand that. And so there can be some of the spaces that we create in festivals, particularly major ones, that have a certain, I can only think of the word wankiness, but that's not what I mean, but like that's probably what some people would call it, a certain amount of stature and, you know, wankiness, and that kind of, that's how they perceive it, and it doesn't feel like it's their place. And we create all this infrastructure sometimes around stuff that doesn't make it feel like it's necessarily their place. And so that's what's the beauty of festivals sometimes in these sort of spaces in laneways that are accessible, is that people can come along to that and see that it is actually a space for them. So taking my mum, for example, she went on one of the bike tours for Brisbane Street Art Festival just to try and be more supportive. Also, my face is on a building in Brisbane, so that was probably really why she wanted to go. And so she could take over that part of the tour. But like ever since then, she has this fascination for street art because it was explained to her, and it wasn't some swanky event in some cool warehouse that she didn't feel like she should go to. It was on a bicycle, something that she uses every day. It was just an everyday person just explaining it to her, and it broke down, I think some of the classism, and even that can be linked to education. As someone who, you know, I'm highly educated, and I'm aware that sometimes when I speak I'm doing it. So yeah, that's what the beauty of festivals can do. We can create spaces where different groups of people can feel like it is for them.
So bringing art to the people rather than the people to the art. What about you, Paul? Because Anywhere Theatre Festival says it all, doesn't it, really?
Yeah, Anywhere Festival. Yeah, look, it's... yeah, there's so many points to pick up on that. So one of the things that has always been a driver for the festival, in a way it's been a bit of an anti-festival. You know, it's not, you know, 40,000 people in a field. In fact, if you don't know it's on, you might not see it because it's in people's backyards, it's in lighthouses, it's in airport hangars, whatever. So in that way, it's a bit of an anti-festival. But it also has an important message, and that is that you know, we talk about, you know, there's always these strategies to bring people into theatres to experience the art, but yet again, that's just a physical structure that we've built, or built a number of them that we've built. that I feel has really just siloed or many people perceive it, that it has siloed the art of storytelling. One of the things I feel is really important about festivals like Anywhere Festival, where people go into somebody's house and see an intimate performance with 20 or 30 other people, is that it's allowing people and bringing people back to this, something that we know is this incredibly old art of storytelling. We sit around the campfire whilst we're walking or whatever, telling stories. And I feel that every time I go into a theatre to watch a performance, all of a sudden it's as if I'm being given permission to watch this performance happen. Whereas I feel, and at the same time, losing my ability to tell stories because I'm just watching something else. And that's why I think festivals where it becomes something where people are actually all together and telling their own stories, even if that's around a little performance or a bigger performance, and there's all these opportunities for people to tell their own stories because they're sitting around tables or they're sitting on someone's back deck instead of just sitting in rows in a theatre where it's all dark and they come in and then with the people they arrived with and then leave with the people they arrived with, and that's it. And I think that's fundamental if we want to recapture this, for many of us, this connection, this telling of stories, of our own stories. And okay, yes, without a big theatre, you can't get the latest production of Guys and Girls in, but you can get your own stories. And really, that's what I feel is most vital about, I think, any festival, but particularly our festival.
So if festivals are really about a place of storytelling, is one of the key ingredients that interaction with the story? Is it easier to interact with the stories of a festival when they are in our places rather than in the venues and the halls of culture?
Festivals are multiple stories. I think they're multi-layered stories as well. I guess what you take home from the festival is important. In what there may be a common theme that runs through, or two or three common themes that cross across the programming of the festival. So you're taking home some kind of change. I'm hoping that ultimately our festival will grow to help change and drive change in Toowoomba in certain ways. Bit like this earlier today when we were hearing about the groundswell, that people suddenly get it and, yeah. So stories, yeah, so they take home stories, they take home the meaning, I guess, that they find.
So when you do that, when you're presenting these stories, what are you looking for? What sort of spaces are you looking for? If people out here are thinking, oh, I could do that in my place, what tips would you give them in identifying the right sort of places or good places? What lens or cap do you put on when you're thinking about where you might locate something?
So I start, well, there's the matching of what the program is with what the space is, and they kind of go hand in hand. Sometimes you're choosing a program and then you need to find a space for it. Sometimes you've got a fabulous space and you need to find a program for it, but they have to sit together. They don't work if they don't match, if that makes sense.
What about you?
In terms of the space?
When you're looking for venues or everyday places to put your events, what sort of things do you look at?
So I'm usually, the festival sites usually are chosen. So for me, it's about leveling the playing field, if that makes sense. So we're Big Sound, Spotify sponsored a First Nations house. So instead of that being, so it was about kind of examining, and the reality is that festival happens in existing music venues and nighttime entertainment spaces, basically, in the Fortitude Valley. Mm-hmm. So it was really important that the First Nations house was reflective of how Big Sound did everything. So we took over a swanky bar restaurant and had like Reco Rennie's artwork splashed all over it. It was called Big Sound First Nations House. And so that was about kind of levelling that playing field rather than it being what, you know, it would look very different here. It would look very different somewhere else, whereas it was really important that it looked like that at that particular event because that's what everyone else is given. So absolutely First Nations people should be at least given that. So, and then like, even then, sorry, one of the highlights of that festival was the Big Sound, we had a First Nations Spotify mixer and it had like a lineup going out the front. And then once I cottoned on that Indigenous people weren't getting in, I was just going into the line and getting them out and putting them in front of everyone else, which was like, so a lot of it's also about the processes that we do to flip the like status quo, which is around who gets privilege and who doesn't in these spaces, and making sure that kind of happens. So for me, it's kind of looking at the spaces. I'm already given the space, so someone else has decided what the festival spaces are, and then, or what they need to look like, and then about finding what is the most appropriate thing. And that's not and that's not my choice either. That comes from chatting with other people. So with Big Sound, it came to just knowing that that was happening and talking to the various people that I ran into who were working in the music industry who were Indigenous. With Yonder Festival coming up, hopefully we'll be able to, because it's the first time it's happening, get some of the Cubby Cubby elders out there and talk to them. And also because it's a young person's festival where there's a whole other reason why some festivals exist that we're not diving into, but that's neither my days of that have passed. But I'm making sure that Indigenous young people are also driving some of the programming and spaces at that festival, because of some of the festivals that are happening for young people, we should absolutely be having Indigenous young people drive what that looks like for them.
Because otherwise they're not going to engage with it.
Pardon?
Otherwise they're not going to engage with it, are they?
Well, yeah, it's like, what do they want to see?
Yeah, and where do they want to see it?
And where do they want to see it?
Yeah.
So, and some things were as simple as, bless them, like, you know, when you have the sunscreen station, have some coconut oil for their hair, because it's very different for some of the Indigenous women and their hair at those festivals. So some of it was little stuff. It was just applying someone else's lens, a lens that's often forgotten, but includes a significant group of people that will resonate with it, to the actual operations of it, including spaces and sites.
Right, thank you. Paul, what about you? I've heard you've done theatre performances in anything from toilet blocks to bus stations. Tell us what you're looking for when you're doing that.
Look, one of the big things for it is that we want people to, because actually I think the title is about transforming the festival. And when I sat down and thought about it, I went, actually, that's the complete opposite of actually how we see what we do. We don't want to transform a space. We want to find and use a space very much as is. We don't want someone coming to us that, I don't know, wants to do a play where it's set in a heritage home and then performing it in the basement and putting up a set to make it look like a heritage home. It's all this idea that you have performances and stories that are coming to us and they're saying, okay, this is a story about a lighthouse. All right, so we'll then go and look for a lighthouse where that can happen, because one, it's an easy bit of set design if it's already there, and also from the point of view of this exploration for a couple of things. From the performer's point of view, to be able to devise and create a work that works within that space is quite amazing and a different process, instead of trying to impose a normal theatrical structure onto it. So you've got that bit, but then you've got, from an audience point of view, because this performance has been done in a place where possibly they drive by or walk by this place, all of a sudden they start to connect their own stories with that place, because they have seen it, whether it is in someone's back deck or whether it is in the local cafe or in the laneway. All of a sudden people are starting to build up those stories of their area and also the people within it. So the short answer is, when someone comes to us with an idea, yes, they might know where they want to put it, we just try and find that space, or we find something as close to it as possible, and that's it. So we don't have restrictions in that way, except what people will let us use.
So what I'm hearing is that you're all open. I think the thing about the level playing field is really interesting, so that you've got light fuck if you like. But if you determine that you're going to be in a lighthouse, or you're in a laneway, or you're in a bar that's seen in a different way, what kind of infrastructure do you need to put in place? Now, I don't mean, okay, we need lighting bars and things like that. How flexible do you need to be in order to fit your space?
I'll go with that one first. Mission with performances, I think so many people have been trained and also seen how performances happen in the traditional theatre or pub environment, where you've got rows of seating, you've got light and sound, and therefore people design and think of their show in that context. Right? Feel there's just this huge point that is being missed. That once again, when you generally going with a show that has a smaller capacity as well, I mean, so we're not sort of a festival of 40,000 people in it in one place. It's all these little things that are 20, 40, 50 people. All of a sudden, from an infrastructure point of view, it's in many ways not much more than an extended family picnic, depending on the size of your family. So once again, from an infrastructure point of view, it is more about saying, right, let's just make sure that there are a few little things around accessibility and making sure that people can get in there. But it's about not transforming space. It's about using that space as much as possible as it is, so that the performers, the audience, and people of that space are able to connect and see it as it is, and put new meaning on it, as opposed to imposing some other structure onto it. So I'd say we do it by not doing it.
So you're sort of working with the venues, you're working with the spaces rather than injecting your personality. What about you, Ruth?
I think it's about the strength is the story that's being told, or the performer that is telling the story. That's the core for me. And then, depending on the space and its capabilities and whether you can put lights or structures or seating, etc., that's secondary in some ways, because if the story is being told and the story is strong, what you can do to enhance that is an added bonus. And I think you can tell stories in various different ways in different spaces, and they're received in different ways because of those different spaces that they're told in. That sometimes the space brings a new added element to a story. But to me, the story or the art that's being told is where you start, and then put the infrastructure around that.
Yes, so some of the terms I will use are because I don't know Cubby and Wiradjuri language myself, which would have had the terms that I'm trying to find. So the words we have for now, but I need paid Indigenous governance to do my job, because I don't know. So for a festival that's perhaps out in the open, like a music festival, I don't know, I know the significance of bunya trees on my country, but I don't know the significance of specific sites. So I need paid Indigenous governance to be able to do my job effectively. In a different context, whether that's working on, say, Horizon Festival, I need Cubby and Jinnabara traditional custodians and peoples working across the arts, and perhaps in cultural heritage or wherever that needs to be. I need them to be paid to provide the kind of advice, more than advice, decision making that are required. And we're having these conversations because Big Sound sits under Q Music. There's going to need to be almost two things, because Q Music is very focused on occupied Queensland, and so that's going to need something there. But Big Sound is national, and it's really about the music industry. So Queensland will have to deal with some cultural protocols, and then Big Sound definitely has to have representatives from the musicians in the music industry. So in order for me to do my job in the best way that I can, I need, and I say paid a lot, because we seem to, in this sector, in particular the arts industry, we seem to understand that we pay everyone else for advice, but still not necessarily Indigenous people. So that's the main bit of infrastructure that I need to do my job.
That comes back to the ingredients question, isn't it? So that if we want to take it to the lighthouse or the space, the street, wherever it is, making sure that that space is okay. There hasn't been a massacre on that side, or some sacred space that needs to be respected in a certain way. We don't think about those things mostly. So I think that's a really interesting point, and we would pay a lighting technician to come in and assess the lighting for a festival, but do people pay Indigenous First Nations peoples to come and do an audit of that space at the thinking stage before it's on the ground? It's interesting. Yeah.
The answer is no. No, and you save yourself a lot of time, because then you save yourself having a First Nations producer who has to come and do all this huge overhaul. We can just focus on the business of letting people tell their stories rather than having to combat the industry all the time.
That's interesting. How important is that place to the vibe or the theme of the festival? And I think that goes to another question that was through the Arts Front site was how important is the name of the festival to its success? So the place and the name, how important is that for a festival's success?
I think you do, yeah, the places, the infrastructure, let's say, that you put around that, the colour, the visibility, that sort of makes it look like a festival.
October, or I might try and do this thing myself. It doesn't have to be within the festival. And I say that because, so the festival anyway has been going for 10 years now, or just about 10 years, we're going into our 10th. And in the original, very long business plan that it did for a strategic plan, it said actually hoping in 20 years we actually don't need to exist as a festival.
Why so?
Because we want it so that by the time the festival has got to 20, the humble age of 20, that people are just telling stories, doing performances, and doing it themselves. They don't need a festival to really draw attention to this anymore. That's really what we're trying to build up to. It's this thing to say, look, you don't have to wait for the circus to come to town. You can create your own circus whenever you want to, and tell your own stories where and when you want.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think there's a thread there. In one sense, what you're saying there is that if we had our druthers, if you like, you wouldn't need an Indigenous producer because you'd just be a producer and everyone would automatically have an Indigenous element to their festivals. They would be places of curiosity, and they would be something that people, it's on an everyday basis that these places are hosting arts spaces. I think that's an interesting thread across the three of you in different kind of ways. I'll just go to the question that was up on the screen, was what are you doing for making your festivals or your events, what compromises and responsibilities do festivals need to consider around green and sustainable practices, and what have you done, or what do you do? Do you want to start with that?
It's been a huge driver from the very beginning, that felt that there was a lot of waste in festivals, not just in all the rubbish, but also just in the setup for it. And that's one of the drivers for anywhere where we're saying, look, all we need is people and a space, and so therefore there is not much else that needs to be wasted or created. We're not, it doesn't use much energy. It's a small gathering. It's from that point of view, it uses so little energy. And it also, at the same time, leverages this whole idea of the festival brand that allows all these individual performers and performers groups that were going to perform, but will probably, hopefully would want to anyway, do it within the festival and either be able to achieve more and be more sustainable in their own practice, not just environmental, but in ourselves as well. And that's a key part of it as well. They'd be able to do something that they couldn't have done either, that possibly couldn't have done normally. And we have stats that say about 75-77% of the people who perform within the festival say that probably would have been very difficult or unlikely that it would have happened without the festival. So it's just about leveraging that, and therefore being able to go, right, that means it's more sustainable for them. We're using spaces as is. We're not using any or very little lighting, sound, all that kind of stuff. So from that point of view, we're not generating more waste as well.
Interesting.
Personally, in the first iteration of the festival, we didn't have a lot of opportunity to put in sustainable practices, but we did engage the most sustainable, what would you call it, rubbish removal company that we know do good recycling. The venue itself doesn't have a lot of opportunity for that, but that's something that they're also working on. It's certainly something that's in my mind from a personal experience this year, going to Antarctica and also going to Borneo to see the orangutans in the same year. You kind of get a sense of what you need to do to save the planet in some ways. So it's something that I'll be looking at. I think the other term of sustainability is about all this energy going into a festival and what comes out of it that is retained and used again and not lost. So that's also about finding those pathways for some of the work that's created to have another life or go on, or the artists who learnt something to have another opportunity to engage with that. So I guess I look at sustainability in a number of ways in that way.
What about the music industry?
Well, I think first and foremost, and I've seen many other people say this, other Indigenous artists say this, sustainability and land rights go hand in hand. It would be nice to see the country not cherry pick the climate strike and to turn up for Indigenous protests as well, because it's the same thing, and it's what my community have been marching for a really long time and have been mourning everyone about and not caring for country. So I think the music industry, they know that they are responsible, particularly some of the larger festivals, for significant waste, and I know that they're making steps towards that. The festival I'm working on at the moment, Yonder Festival, is a boutique festival, which means really it's just a smaller number of people as well as a range of other things. And that's what I've noticed working on smaller festivals is A, it's a nicer time because people interact with one another better because they're not overcrowded. B, you can actually look after the country and therefore the environment much better because of that kind of more manageable kind of site. And so in another festival they worked on, they did ban single-use water bottles and just, dealt with that. Water was available everywhere. And I mean, I even had to say to some members on my team, like, yep, you can't get cold water, but you can get ice at the bar, and this is what it takes. This is what it takes to have like a sustainable practice. So, is there a question?
Yeah, my name's Ken Starkey, First Nations musician and artist. Now, you're talking about sustainability and ecology and caring for country, which we all do as First Nations peoples. Now, we have a digital footprint here. Straight away, I've been asked to go into the Arts Front website to fill a question. Now, that's going to be a question what I want to ask now. That's creating a digital footprint. Now, I was sitting with our Sunshine Coast University data analysis the other day on the music industry, and he told me that in the last 12 months of streaming, we've created the largest carbon footprint we've been through all bioprocessing of the music industry. And yet now, our festivals, our community gatherings are all driven through technology, digital footprints, and a massive carbon footprint. This is why I'm excited to speak organically rather than through a digital platform.
Can I answer that question, because that's a really good point. Digital technology has its own traffic and its own carbon footprint, as you say. In Queensland, for us to deliver a regional arts conference and festival, we know that there are so many barriers to people to be able to come together and attend that. So we actually did quite an audit and discussion around how we would make this festival sustainable as much as possible, which is, it's a small token for what we would like to be able to do, but it's the water bottles and things like that. But one of them was that reduction of emissions from people actually travelling to this event from wherever they were, how we might offset, how we might avoid, reduce and then offset those things. And so the streaming going into 14 hubs around Australia is one way to reduce our carbon input. So yes, I hear on one side of it, it is a digital traffic and it has its own pollution, if you like. On the other side of it, it reduces it and by significantly by not having the airwaves, and also people can listen and absorb on country wherever they might be in this country and be part of the conversation, because these questions are coming from people online. So it's an interesting, I think that we should take that into consideration. How do we manage this digital technology as opposed to, especially in a place like Queensland where the distances are so great. But that's a really good point and interesting to raise. Thank you.
And I think it might, I don't know, it's not my area, but I think that it lies in our thinking and our processes versus than tangible things. And that's what I think, that's what I think because in terms of knowledge systems, so in the way that we care for something, because we can't predict the technology that we have, but we have to be able to predict how we consume things and how we manage things and how we connect with one another. So I think that some of our thinking is probably what needs to be, the mainstream thinking needs to change and adapt.
It's interesting, isn't it? It seems there's a thread coming through in the conversations I've been hearing today and previously when we talk about the environment, it's slowing down, getting back to communicating, connecting, putting feet on the ground without all the razzmatazz, which is also what you're saying in your festivals. Can I ask everyone to give our panel a round of applause? It's been really interesting conversation. Paul, Ruth, Lisa, thank you so much. Thank you for your question. Okay. Our next discussion is rethinking our cultural venues, because if a venue is the only place where you see culture, we've just disproven that. So what do we need to do to rethink our cultural venues? And then I'll remind you that at 3:30 we've got the Arts Ablaze Cafe, which was pulling together the day's discussions, and that's about transformation of place. So thank you very much for your attendance.
What's her name? Selena. Alright, I'm going to give her a call.